Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues of intelligence, technology, and business. It's September 22nd, 2025. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I'm good, Eric. I love this time of year. We've talked about my love of sports.
Yeah.
And this is just a great nexus of a whole bunch of seasons. You know, you've got college football, just getting into the games that matter. You've got pro football. You've got the end of the baseball season. But I need to talk about my Caitlin Clark. So the Indiana Fever, her team, has just been decimated by injury. Over the course of the season, I think they lost 4 guards, 2-point guards, and 2 guards who stood in at point. And they were left for dead by the pundits of 1, even making the playoffs, and then 2, advancing the playoffs. Lo and behold, they won the first round of the playoffs against a very good Atlanta Dream team. And then last night, they beat the number 2 seed Las Vegas Aces, and so that was a big win. So one, I found that I'm now not just a Caitlin Clark fan, but I'm an Indiana Fever fan. I love their grit. I did tell you, next season, I've decided that I'm going to, when I'm healthy, I'm going to go see the Indiana Fever play in every WNBA venue next year. That's my plan.
Oh, nice. That'd be cool.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, September 22nd, and for a couple weeks now, I've seen a lot of Halloween decorations going up.
Boo.
Is it appropriate? Nice. Is it appropriate to hang your Halloween decorations already, or is it too early? What's the earliest you could put them up?
Way too early. 1 October. In September. You can acquire them. Oh, and don't buy the candy early because it will all be gone. I think for Halloween, it's just too early. It's too specific. It's too fun. And then plus, if you put them up too early, have you taken away some of the excitement of the day for your kids? And I think so much of Halloween is just like wonder and awe around, the kid-like experience of being something other than who you are. So too early.
I agree. I think it should be 1 October. That said, I do enjoy seeing them at other people's houses, and the kids certainly love them. So,
do you have Halloween inflatables?
Oh, yeah. Inflatables for not all seasons, but Halloween and Christmas, yeah.
Yeah, good. You have kids. You should.
Yeah, they love them, and they love to run into them. I don't know how long they'll last because they love to bounce off them and run into them, but yeah, they're fun.
Yeah, your oldest will try and scale one, will try and wrestle it to the ground and
run through it.
Yeah,
and then the baby will probably try to bite it.
Probably. There you go. Oh, yeah. Where'd that hole come from? I love it.
All right, let's get to some headlines. So this week in the threat picture, a quick update on what we've been watching. China is discouraging companies to buy NVIDIA chips and our response to Director Patel's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee last week. Finally, we have our first guest. The Honorable Shannon Corless will join us to discuss crypto, digital assets, and the pending sale of TikTok to U.S. investors.
Yeah, you and I have known what we wanted to talk about with a guest, and we had Shannon pegged for a long time. We just wanted for you and I to be ready to support a guest. So I am super excited about this segment and our listeners getting to hear from Shannon. She's special.
Yep, we got 10 under our belt. It's time to do it. So we'll start today with the Cyberspace Administration of China has instructed major tech firms to stop buying or testing specific NVIDIA parts. This is guidance that functions like a de facto ban for state-influenced companies, discouraging purchase of NVIDIA chips by Chinese customers. We talked about it in episode 3, as I alluded to. NVIDIA just got the go-ahead from the Trump administration to sell the H20s in China. And so, Sue, do they have all the chips they need to copy? Are they trying to encourage domestic production, or do you think this is another tariff negotiating tool on the part of China?
I think it's 2.5 of those. Do they have all the chips they need to copy? I don't think any nation state ever wants to shut themselves off to seeing what competitors are doing. And in the case of China and the U.S., kind of the conventional wisdom has been the U.S. leads in design. and where we have offshored was the production and manufacturing where China has had the upper hand. And so I suppose this could signal that China is getting more and more confident in its own design capability and then consequently turning the production on to their own designs. Certainly, that's a direction they've been going. Anyone who is still espousing that they don't have their own indigenous high-tech industry just hasn't been watching. What they've done in terms of high-performance computing, where they're almost if they're not equivalent to the United States, it's hard to tell the difference. So on the one hand, it could signal that increasing confidence. Equally likely is they are trying to encourage domestic production. Just think the obverse of what the U.S. is doing with trying to encourage the onshoring and the purchase of U.S. products. And I think it could be part of the tariff negotiation, which is saying, you want to do that? We'll do it. Especially the timing of it feels a little tariff negotiating to me, where you get the U.S. government to agree to selling a really high-performance chip to an adversary or competitor, and then just when you cut that deal, which again, you and I have talked about, being able to sell U.S. products is important to U.S. leadership. Right as you cut that deal, you turn around and say, "Nah, never mind." So if I had to weight the three, I'd probably go in reverse order. Tariff negotiating, encourage Chinese production, and sign of increasing confidence in their own design capability.
It also might lend a little bit of commentary to DeepSeek's claim previously that they didn't need as many
Yep.
GPUs as OpenAI did to train, and how they made so many investments without all these chips. I think it is, to your point, more tariffs and more encouraging domestic capability, because at any point we could shut off the H-20s again and not send them to them. And then if they've relied on them, they're out of luck.
Yeah, but the opposite of that is at any point they can decide that they're not going to allow China, that consumer base, to be available to the US. So this is just a really interesting game of economic geopolitics in terms of what's the balance that serves everyone's interests, because I think now you see actors being willing to make more draconian steps in their interests and playing that tit for tat game. The other thing I will say is, and you and I talked about it, I think almost in our very first segment, was this notion of the U.S. has gained a lot of advantage from insight into the piece parts that our adversaries and competitors use in their weapons systems. And so if this continues to be a trend, it's an interesting pressure point on national security and wisdom and insight into performance.
Absolutely. Moving on to our next topic, Director Patel went before the Senate Judiciary Committee last week. So Sue wanted to get some of your comments outside of the shouting matches in the nearly 4-hour testimony. What was kind of some of your reaction? Or maybe the shouting matches were part of some of your reaction.
I think my disappointment was they didn't take my first question and say, "What do you think your job and responsibility is?" Because I think that's always a great question to ask any leader, to say, do you know what your job is?" Which
Yeah.
seems almost pedantic, but it is a real forcing function. I thought the brokenness of our system in terms of the necessary intersection of the branches of our government, it is really important that the legislative and the executive branches be able to understand that they each have a role, the satisfaction of the American people and of our systems. And I think it still seemed really broken in terms of just the adversarial nature. Now, I've sat on the other side of that witness table, and I confess that I have been delighted when a senator who was asking me hard questions filibustered and used all their time on their
On the soliloquy. Yeah.
on their soliloquy. But I just think just the anger that yielded no answers to the questions that we really have. A little bit heartened that the Republican senators and representatives were asking a little bit harder questions. And to me, if we can get to that, then we get to the legislature being the oversight it's supposed to be. So I think it's still broken, but maybe some signs of progress. I will say Director Patel's disrespect was shocking even to me. Not that I haven't felt like yelling out periodically, but if you take a top line of this administration that has been, we don't want unelected bureaucrats having undue power. In a weird sort of way, Kash Patel is a bureaucrat now, right? He's a political appointee. He wasn't elected to it. And those people to whom he was speaking, they are the people's representatives. So a little disappointed in the disrespect, and I found it unhelpful in terms of getting where we needed to go. So I'd love it if that would be cleaned up just because I find it hard to watch and, again, more unhelpful because these are real questions that we have. The broad question is, have our institutions become tools of a political agenda? And if you strip out what this really was about, it was questions about that. I thought there were some moments that were actually normal and helpful. Ones where you're talking about what are you doing with your budget? What are you doing with your resources? Those are all super important questions to be had. And the last thing I'll just say is just for everyone who's listening, a public hearing, everyone's putting on a show. That the real work, an open hearing, that the real work of oversight is typically done in closed hearings. And for those that are dismayed by that as though there's no work that can go on, I am quite confident that there is both cross-aisle work and also real discussions that are being had with some of these agencies. They just happen in closed hearings where the issue tends to take dominance rather than the position any individual is taking. So I'm gonna hold out a little hope that there are more rational conversations, and I'm gonna hold out that hope because there were some moments even in that one that seemed to be a little rational. But come on, respect each other, do the job of the American people.
Yep. Show some doggone respect. I agree. Also encouraging,
Right.
there were some questions, even though there's plenty of grandstanding, right, and
Yep.
plenty of soliloquies, there were some poignant questions in there, and they're asking some of the right questions. And Director Patel did have some
He did?
numbers up front about the great work that the FBI is doing. I think my follow-on question for you there is, especially in today's modern world, the FBI plays a significant role in our national security infrastructure and defending the American people. Do you feel confident that we're positioned well and we're using the FBI's resources well, given that testimony and those improvement in numbers in certain areas?
Yeah, my criticism of, quite frankly, most of the political appointees of this administration has been that they're chasing ghosts, not dealing with the real issues that we think we have. To your point, Eric, I think there were moments where the questions were about and Director Patel was answering, where are we putting our resources? What are we doing? Those are the sorts of things that you really need to hear because there are choices that are being made. So I think there's a question still about whether that institution is independent of personal agenda. But I think there are some signs, and this is where oversight can help, where they're asking and he is learning to answer the question about where they're going in terms of the job they have as the FBI, not in particular cases. But still, and this is just a moment of personal privilege, oh my gosh, release the Epstein stuff. I don't know how anyone comes across on a different side of that one. We'll have real humans that are real victims that deserve some answers. And my answer, if there are bums that are gonna be exposed, expose them, and then we're strong enough to deal with that moment too.
Yep. We're strong enough to deal with it and help recover
Yeah,
for the victims and the country.
victims in the country. And my guess is there's enough shame and misbehavior that this isn't likely to be partisan at the end. It will show what we need to do as a nation in terms of protection of those rights.
Yep. All right. The moment we've all been waiting for. Let's move on to bringing in our first guest. So, the Honorable Shannon Corless is a former career intelligence officer who started her career as an intern with the Office of Naval Intelligence. She spent the entirety of her career at the intersection of national security and economics, the bulk of which was spent leading the IC's support to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. For her final act in government, she had the opportunity to serve for 3 years as the Assistant Secretary of the Department of the Treasury's Office of Intelligence and Analysis. You never forget your first. So we're super excited to have you on today, Shannon. Thank you for joining us. And wanted to start by asking you, what's going on with your Florida State Seminoles picking on these weak teams, Texas A&M East and Kent State? When are we going to get a real schedule here? Get a real test?
Starting Friday when they play at UVA at Charlottesville. So that'll be the
Ooh,
ACC opener for Florida State, and we'll see how it goes. Next week is Miami at home.
that's going to be a tough
So
one.
these
Yeah.
were the morale booster games. We had Alabama, which was a huge win. I don't think anybody expected to win and to win by that margin.
Yeah.
And then we got the morale boosters, and now we'll see how it goes on Friday evening.
Okay, so now you've just experienced the Honorable Shannon Corless as I experienced her. So she's been my first twice. She was actually my first briefing when I was the principal deputy director of national intelligence. And I noticed a couple things in that meeting. One, you're going to discover that she's brilliant. Two, you're going to discover that she speaks in the most clear, simple, declarative, least jargonistic way. And three, she is smooth as all get out, because I noticed that you just skipped over the taunt on the weakness of your schedule. And anytime Duke is playing a tougher schedule than Florida State, sister, come on, they need to buck up.
I will say everybody's been doing that. Texas took on UTEP 2 weeks ago, just took on Sam Houston State over the weekend. Getting warmed up before league play. I get it, but wanted to pick on you a little bit there. Now, we're super excited because, as we mentioned over previous episodes, we've talked a little bit about crypto and digital assets. In episode 5 of the Understandable Insights podcast, we talked about the Genius Act setting the initial policy for stablecoins in the U.S. And more recently, in episode 9, we talked about the launch of the Trump family's World Liberty Financial, WFLI token, and the subsequent, quote, billions in paper wealth that it generated. There's way more to the digital assets industry than we have time for in this episode. But Shannon, can you start out by giving us a little background on what the blockchain is and a little bit about digital assets 101?
Absolutely. I'll do my best. And I think we should probably start with blockchain because I think it's pretty foundational to most digital assets, right? So blockchain very simply is the technology on which digital assets moves. It's otherwise known as distributed ledger technology or distributed ledger systems. And a super simple way to think about it is to think about the paper ledger that you use to balance your checkbook back in the day, or that companies you would use to manage their transactions, track their debits and credits, right? Except here, it's far more complicated because we're really talking about thousands of distributed systems that are tracking transactions immediately as they happen without human interference. And so one really interesting benefit of this is that it's all public record. It's very transparent. And once the transactions are recorded, they are immutable. So that's really fantastic, particularly if you're in the law enforcement business, right? You can see the transactions of concern as they're happening. Of course, a downside is that you don't always know who the individuals are behind the transactions. So for all the transparency that they do offer, they're not 100% transparent. So that's blockchain 101, if you will, and it's far more complicated than that. But it's the technology on which the digital assets move. So then we're moving to digital assets, broadly speaking. It's an umbrella term for anything that has value and is digital, right? So we're talking about cryptocurrencies, non-fungible tokens, central bank digital currencies. Real estate can be digital, if you will. It's a strange thing, I know, but it can be.
Cool.
But cryptocurrency, to start with, has its roots back in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, when there was a desire for a more transparent way of transacting financial transactions and also getting away from the traditional banking system. So it was essentially a decentralized way to transact payments around the world. There are a couple of cryptocurrencies that are very well known, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the like. The value of those cryptocurrencies is not pegged to a stable asset. So it's a very volatile type of currency. Then there's stablecoin, which you all have referenced in your prior podcast. And that's meant to capitalize on the benefits of cryptocurrency, the technology benefits, the security benefits of cryptocurrency. However, it's pegged to a stable asset like the US dollar or gold. And so it's really meant to be a bridge to tie the traditional financial system to the new world of fintech and to also reduce the volatility of the system. There are meme coins, which are cryptocurrencies that are essentially tied to jokes, if you will. But I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind about cryptocurrencies is that they're not insured by the FDIC. So at least at this point in time, there is a bit of risk that goes along with investing in cryptocurrencies. Then if you move to central bank digital currencies or CBDCs, you can think of these as digital cash, but it's centralized as opposed to decentralized, like the cryptocurrencies that I was just speaking about. Central bank digital currencies are issued by a country's central bank. So it would be akin to the Federal Reserve issuing a central bank digital currency, which, as I understand it, is off the table for right now, or at least not as a strong a contender as it had been before. But there are some benefits and disadvantages to talk about. First, it can be considered a more inclusive way of banking, so you don't necessarily need to have a bank account in order to have access to a digital currency. It could allow for faster payments. It could allow for faster distribution of aid in a crisis. But there are some significant downsides to a central bank digital currency. First, I think there are some legitimate concerns about the impact to financial stability in the event of a crisis, particularly if it's the US dollar that is a central bank digital currency, because a CBDC essentially becomes part of critical financial infrastructure. So if there's a cyber attack, that really puts at risk the security of financial infrastructure. But I think for the US, the greater concern, and this is something that you two have hit on your prior podcasts, the greater concern really with the CBDC is civil liberty and privacy. Because then what happens is you are giving the central bank insight into your spending habits, and they understand what you're spending. That gives you opportunities for influence. There are concerns about surveillance that come along with that. And so I think really that is probably, at least in my mind, the overwhelming argument against a CBDC for the US.
Wow, that was fantastic. We've kind of made 2 points. One is we're glad that the US is getting into the digital currency game because the world is, right? And leadership is important. So pretending that it isn't existing or that we're going to hold on to the position that we've had in the financial market seems myopic if we don't play. And the other argument we've made is there is something inherently, I'm going to say American, but I'll go free and open society about individuals having control over their assets and the control that the digital currencies do add at the speed and how I manage my assets. Okay, slam those two things together with your concern and tell me, what do you think the next thing that we're likely to see happen on the way to digital currency being a more robust piece of what we're doing nationally?
That's a great question. So I think the point that you made a moment ago about cryptocurrency digital assets are basically here to stay, right? When I first touched this issue maybe 10 years ago or so, it still seemed to me, and I wasn't nearly as connected to it as I am now, it still seemed to me like it was going to be sort of a passing fad, a novelty, right? But I think the reality is everybody finally realizes that this is something that's here to stay, and it's crucial for the US from an innovation standpoint, and it's an opportunity for us to continue to lead and be the standard setter, if you will, for financial technologies. Where this goes next, it's good to see the Hill getting involved. It's good to see the White House trying to figure out how to do this. This is a really great example of how national security and economic security are very blended, right? They're no longer two separate topics. We need to allow enough room for innovation to continue, but it does need guardrails, right? And we also don't want to inject too much volatility to the global financial system and create room for all sorts of unintended consequences. But whatever we can do to ensure that introduction of digital assets allows us to protect the role of the dollar as the global reserve currency, that's where I think we need to go.
Awesome. Thanks. I've just determined that we could take this whole episode just asking follow-on questions of Shannon based on what she said before. But
Oh, for sure.
drive us, sir.
It sounds like you're generally net positive on this. And I think we have been as well with the legislation and some additional guidance and the regulation and policy there. But we've also heard many negatives, and you alluded to that lack of transparency in terms of you're able to track it, but you aren't necessarily able to know who's making the transactions. And I know some nefarious actors like North Korea have financed a lot of their nuclear program through crypto transactions in the past. So You've already touched on what some of the upsides are, but have you always shared this positive view?
I don't think I fully understood the upsides when I first came across this topic about 10 years ago or so, because at the time, I really saw it as another avenue for bad actors to move money to perpetuate bad activities, right? And so
Mhm.
whether it is, North Korean money launderers or terrorists or whatever it might be, that was really the way I was looking at it. And it wasn't really until probably about 5 or 6 years ago when I had an opportunity to speak with somebody who was in the industry who sort of explained the benefits of this from a transparency perspective and how it could be a boon for law enforcement, that I really started to think differently about it, not only the benefits from a transparency perspective, but the benefits from an innovation perspective and the benefits as redundancy for our payment rails in the event something were to go bad with the US traditional financial system. But there are still some challenges that we need to address. I mean, it is still an avenue for bad actors to move their monies to perpetuate bad activities, whether we're talking about terrorists or sanction states, people who no longer have access to SWIFT and who are not necessarily going to stop planning their bad activities just because they don't have access to SWIFT anymore. And so cryptocurrencies provides a way as an alternative payment system for them to perpetuate their bad activities. It's a huge capability for our cyber and ransomware actors, right? And it can pose a risk to the loss of dollar dominance. But that's why I think it's so important for the US to really make sure that we are doing everything we can to step up and lead in developing stable coins or whatever it might be to ensure that we're protecting the role of the dollar.
Yeah, but Shannon, you just touched on my biggest worry, which is just how bereft we are still on protecting against cyber actors. And even though blockchain itself is really a very stable way of protecting the transaction, we see this in critical infrastructure all the time. Yeah, you've protected the functioning, but the businesses all around it are equally disruptible. Maybe one of the things that we need to see is continued growth along the path of if you're going to participate, you have to demonstrate some level of cybersecurity as a private entity in
Hmm.
order to be able to be part of the ecosystem. Because that's really where we still haven't found a good solution. Government protects itself, and then when the private sector is attacked because cyber criminals go after the weak point, then we tell them that they need to protect themselves more, but we haven't really set a standard. So I wonder if that's one of the things that you think we need to do in order to continue evolving along this path of, I hate overregulation except when there's a standard that needs to be met, and sometimes that's exactly where the government needs to play.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair observation. I mean, if we are looking at the traditional banking system, if you will, and I can speak from personal experience, there's a very strong partnership between the Department of the Treasury and the systemically important banks, and I mean, banking system in general, because there is a recognition of how important it is to make sure that financial infrastructure stays secure so that in the event there is some sort of a cyber incident that affects one bank, that it doesn't affect the entirety of the banking system. The reality is everything is interconnected. I completely agree that there should be some responsibility there for ensuring that these cryptocurrencies, these digital assets, whatever form they might be, have some appropriate level of cybersecurity.
Yeah, so maybe that's one of the things we look for is as the cyber policy continues to evolve, does it marry up at some point with the digital asset
Yeah.
strategies? Yeah,
Yeah, for sure. Because you've talked before about how it's not fair that these companies are going up against nation states, or these municipalities or localities are going up against nation states or state sponsored actors that have considerably more resources in terms of their
Right.
cyber capability. But at the same time, I don't want the government tracking all my financial transactions and being that involved. I want to have my own independence there too. We've talked OD and I before, and the disparate agencies, if they're not communicating,
right.
right, you don't know if it's an isolated attack or if it's a broader attack. So you need that overarching organization, I think, or some communication network. How do you reconcile all that together?
For me, and I'll let Shannon get the right answer here, is I think that's my worry. At the time that trust in government is at one of its lowest points, and you have digital currencies becoming available more broadly outside even a centralized banking system. Now you have significant assets of the United States and free and open societies maybe moving outside those areas where we have some standards and control. And that doesn't preclude a crisis just because it doesn't involve the centralized system. So I think that's one of those things we watch for and continue to talk about in terms of how these policies evolve.
I completely agree. And if I could just give a little plug for my old organization, my last job in government, as Eric alluded to, I had the opportunity to lead Treasury's Office of Intelligence and Analysis. And one of the great new capabilities that they stood up was essentially a collaboration center where we can have cleared members of the sector sitting side by side our officers and sharing information back and forth. So you can sort of, not only were we able to share information that we saw and reporting that concerned the security of their infrastructure, they were also able to share with us information that they saw on their systems that we wouldn't otherwise have reason to have access to or know. And that really allows for a fabulous sharing of not only information, but problem solving. And it would be really great to know that as a next step that we're looking at how this goes into protecting digital assets, whatever this alternative
Right.
financial system is.
If I look at my tenure and then what's happened since, I think what CISA did in terms of really talking with the private sector about sharing what the government knew about threats to our digital infrastructure writ large, and what you all did at Treasury in terms of the partnership, that I think is an incredible model, incredible growth. And just to clarify my point, I think the government is far more trustworthy than it has trust, right? And we need to talk
Mhm.
more about those things, that the effort you just described has been going on behind the scenes and has led to great security and great confidence, even if it isn't one of those things that recognize. So for those that are listening to us, don't be confused. Trustworthiness and trust are not always unity. And I think one of the things Shannon is talking about is we need to talk more openly about those activities that we're doing, because I think sometimes they're in the arcanity of what the government does, and we don't talk about them as openly. And I think there's lots of examples of work that is done to benefit society writ large, not just to feather the nest of government bureaucrats.
We talked a little bit policy already. The Genius Act legitimized crypto to some extent, and the Clarity Act, which should be following it, is another one regulating digital commodities. That was approved in the House of Representatives back in July, but is yet to pass the Senate. On August 7th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order called Democratizing Access to Alternative Assets for 401k Investors. This was intended to allow the more than 90 million Americans who participate in employee-sponsored retirement plans, like 401ks, to invest in, quote, alternative assets. That'll include, among others, real estate, commodities, and, quote, holdings and actively managed investment vehicles that are investing in digital assets. You're still unable to buy Bitcoin directly, but in a managed index instead. Many of these cryptos are speculative in nature.
Mhm.
You talked about a little bit with the meme coin and how Bitcoin, although tied more directly to the blockchain and is more legitimate, it's still not backed by anything.
Mhm.
So how would you rack and stack some of these available assets? Would you put stablecoins in first? Would you recommend tying into Bitcoin? Or do you like the ETF style here? And do you think that eventually we'll go to individual coins and things like that in terms of a 401k?
That's a really good question. The fact that we're now talking about it being another asset that we can invest in our 401ks, I don't know how much more permanent it could possibly be. This conversation says more than anything is that the average American who has a 401k really needs to start getting smart on digital assets. If you swing your investments too far towards investing in, even if it's managed, cryptocurrencies, and knowing that it's not insured and knowing that certain cryptocurrencies are highly volatile, that really puts your 401k investments at risk. On the other hand, you can look at it as another diversification in your 401k. So maybe you do a little bit and you have other investments that are in less risky assets, right? That's certainly a way to think about it. My own tolerance is probably to favor more of the stable coins right now, even though it's not insured, at least it's tied to a stable asset. But I think, again, this is just a really great example of how these conversations around national security and economic security are starting to blend. And it really behooves the average American to start getting smart on digital assets, just as they would anything else that their 401k is investing in.
Shannon, I love that point about individuals getting smart, because as I think about it, in terms of my investment portfolio, I'm going to ask my financial advisor. But remember, my financial advisor is going to have a perspective. Heretofore, the answer has been the market tends to go in the same place for Bitcoin and for your other assets. So when they go
Mhm.
up, they all tend to go up. And when they don't, they don't. And so the differential value. But it is a really interesting question of when does that change? And when do I do it? And when does my risk change? I tend to agree with you on the stablecoin right now. I like that as something that is at least tied to an actual asset. But I don't know. I think just watching this space is probably a really good piece of advice. And remember, for everyone who's talking to whoever your team is, you have all the power. Just keep asking questions until you get answers that make sense to you. I will tell you the one thing I still don't understand are NFTs. I just don't. Maybe it's because I'm old, y'all, or whatever. I understand a lot other than that. And meme coins, I understand those, which is why I walk away. But NFTs is one of the more interesting ones to me. So I think this is just a space that's worth watching.
Transitioning from the 401ks, a few weeks ago, we talked about the government taking a 10% stake in Intel, which led us into a discussion of where money goes once it comes into the federal government. And we discussed a little bit places like the Treasury's miscellaneous fund. We also spoke about the idea of the United States creating a sovereign wealth fund, because back in February, amongst the flurry of executive orders put out by the new administration, the president called for developing a plan to create a sovereign wealth fund. Norway, a NATO ally and solid democracy by most accounts, actually has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world with about $1.9 trillion in assets under management. Shannon, I want to get your perspective on the sovereign wealth fund in general, and is there a place for one in the United States?
So I think this is really such a great question. And I remember when the announcement first came out earlier in the administration that we were looking to create a sovereign wealth fund, that the president was issuing the executive order. I was actually very intrigued by the idea. My mind immediately went first to my own personal experience being involved in the CFIUS process and thinking about how we would look at investors who were coming in and either as a primary investor or as a partner in an acquisition of a U.S. company. The questions we would always look at with this, as with any investor, is understanding the depth of the connection to the government and how that relationship might harm U.S. national security interests or perhaps further reinforce our partnerships and be a mitigating factor in an investment. But the more I thought about it, a couple of things came to mind. First, you opened up this question with the reference to Intel. And so I think this is a really interesting way to take a little bit of the burden off of the taxpayer and to invest in a U.S. company, but without it being at the direction of an administration. If we set it up correctly, where the sovereign wealth fund is as independent as possibly could be, independent board or whatnot, it's a really great way to take that burden off. And I also think it's a really great opportunity to invest strategically, both here and abroad. And I think it's a little bit of a new tool that we don't have, a soft power tool, if you will, to counter some of China's investments around the world. We already use the Development Finance Corporation and other financial tools to do that. That's more from a financial assistance perspective, but this would be actually the U.S.'s sovereign wealth fund investing overseas to the strategic benefits of U.S. national security interests. So I actually think it's a really interesting idea. I think having a clearly stated vision of what it's going to do and what its purpose is going to be very important. And I think if we can make it as apolitical as possible, it could be a really powerful new tool in our economic tool set.
So let me just pull on that thread a little bit. So one of the things that I think I've said over and over again on this podcast, just in different subject areas, has been one of the great strengths of America over at least the course of my career has been that we have friends and that we are trusted, that all things being equal, my experience has been that people would rather partner with us. Even in the years when we stopped selling some of the weapons that countries wanted because we just thought it was a bridge too far for us, and they purchased from, say, Russia or China, we knew that they would have preferred the confidence that comes with purchasing from America. I think this is an interesting moment for us to create a sovereign wealth fund that has the advantages that you articulate. And I wouldn't have thought of saying them the way you did, but I think that's right. But I think there is real question globally whether we enjoy the same trust that we did for exactly that reason. We have had that advantage, and do we still enjoy it? It might be interesting to think that if we constructed it well, it could be an important part of that strength geopolitically, even in a politically disrupted time.
To the point that you raised about the trust in the US, right? I think that's why the structure of this is going to be so critically important, because if I put on my old, analyst hat and I am evaluating a transaction or an investment, like I said, one of the first things you're going to look for is how tightly connected is the sovereign wealth fund to the government of that country. Now, of course, it's going to be by virtue connected, but if there's an independent board, there's at least some sort of air of being apolitical and being able to withstand the political winds of change, if you will. But if we don't have that, then I do think that the opportunity for distrust is certainly there.
Shannon, I think that's a great point with some of the other points you've made is it's something for us to look for. Like it's something for us as an observable as these policies evolve. And I think things like this are a really good area to bring our executive and legislative and judicial branches all together, because in order for it to work and to be exactly what you opine would be its great benefit, you have to have that whole structure around it. So, yes, a place we should watch to see if it's going to unfold the way we talk about. I see the benefit, though.
You also had, in the early days of the administration, they influenced BlackRock heavily to invest in the Panama ports. They bought like 90% of the Panama ports. I guess it's more tightening the screws and saying, hey, you will invest in this versus encouraging private sector investment. But this would give you a little bit more control and returns back to the taxpayer.
Yeah, if you set it up right, it's a systemic way, which is what's awesome about government done right, which is repeatable, transparent, and fair. Since we're already kind of in this space, this could be a way in order to actually create something that everyone understands how it works and the opportunity to participate.
I guess so. Maybe that's one distinguishing point between what's the difference between a sovereign wealth fund and some of the other funds that you mentioned before is the tie back to the benefit to the taxpayer.
Right on.
Yep. I was talking about United States investment, but let's talk a little bit more about CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And we talked about this a little bit in episode 9 when we discussed Chinese purchases of U.S. land, particularly around sensitive military sites. So the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States is part of Treasury and is an interagency committee authorized to review certain transactions involving foreign investment in the United States and certain real estate transactions by foreign persons in order to determine the effect of such transaction on national security. Can you give us a little origin story of where the committee came from and what authorities does it or doesn't it have?
Absolutely. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States actually has its roots in the Carter administration. So this is mid-1970s. We've just experienced the oil crisis, and there is growing concern about investments from the Middle East that are coming over into strategic sectors here in the United States. And so he established the committee by executive order first. And at the time, it didn't really have a whole lot of teeth. It was really a committee meant to monitor these transactions. The committee really lacked authority until 1980s when we were getting concerned with investments coming in from Japan. There was an amendment to legislation that created the et florio provision, which rooted the Committee on Foreign Investment in statute. The next real seismic shift was following 9/11. So around 2005 or so, there is an investment in U.S. ports by Dubai Ports World. And the concern that sort of hit the public was that this investment was going to be another way for terrorists to enter the United States because it was, ports company that was owned by a Middle Eastern firm. That really paved the way for the first real legislation that not just simply modernizes CFIUS, but it does one other important thing, which is that it puts the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and by virtue of that, the IC, as a statutory member of the committee ex officio, so no voting, but the Intelligence Committee now has a formal role in the process. Fast forward to 2018, the new seismic events, if you will, are the series of Chinese investments that we've seen over the course of the prior 3 to 5 years or so, most notably in the semiconductor industries, but also in certain real estate investments, as you noted. And so there was a recognition that CFIUS needed to be modernized. So that's when we have the introduction of what is now known as the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. And that really expands the range of transactions that can be reviewed by the committee. Maybe an overly broad statement, but there's very little that is not potentially under the jurisdiction for the committee to review. So it's mergers and acquisitions. We're looking at a foreign company that's buying a U.S. company. We're looking also at foreign investments that might be limited partners, right? So they may not be the primary investor, but it is enough to meet CFIUS's threshold for review. And so CFIUS can look at a range of transactions, whether we're talking about biotechnology, semiconductors, healthcare, certain financial investments as well. And then certainly Sue's beloved TikTok investments is another example of the kinds of things that CFIUS can review.
My beloved TikTok. Shannon, I love this. And one of the things that Eric and I have talked about a lot is I'm not in favor of decoupling the United States from the rest of the world. I'm not in favor of just a priori saying take no foreign investment. I just don't think that's in the best interest of our leadership. I don't think it's best interest of us continuing to have this vibrant, competitive economy. We also talk a lot about a lot of action going on in state and localities of people that may be engaged in activity that's below the threshold that CFIUS might look at it. So can you take your wisdom and say, because one of the things I talk about is know whose money you're taking, know what decision authority you're giving away, but can you give much more sound, practical advice to someone who is approached by a foreign investor about the kind of questions they should ask, even if it hasn't met that threshold, just so they can make sound decisions about what's happening to their interests?
Absolutely. So I think before I give that advice or my perspective, I should say, I want to echo what you just said, which is I think foreign direct investment is essential to the health and the strength of the U.S. economy. So we want to be super careful about how we are messaging when we're having these conversations, whether it's formally as a government to the private sector in general or individually. But I think a couple of things come to mind that I would advise people do, companies do. First is recognize that the government does not distinguish in the way that it necessarily should the difference between general partner and limited partner in terms of the access to information that the limited partner will get. So I know in practicality, limited partners get access to far less than general partners do, right? But the government is really, when it's scrutinizing a CFIUS transaction or it's looking at a grant that it might give to a startup, the government really wants to do everything it can to protect innovation here in the United States, and protect data, protect the intellectual property that is developed here, right? So I would advise that you really need to understand not just simply who your passive investors are, but what it is that the government is trying to protect. Recognize that the government is probably going to squint a little bit when it looks at a passive investor from China. So are we saying no to all Chinese investment? Absolutely not. But think about how you are, as a matter of giving regular updates to that investor. Think about what kind of information you're sharing with them. It may seem normal. You're going to give this investor the same exact information that you would give a U.S. investor. But the way we would look at it is it may not be enabling information as far as you're concerned for your company. However, it might be enabling for China. We can't assume that our baseline is their baseline. And so that's the first thing. I think also, too, you need to look at whether companies are sanctioned. And maybe it's not necessarily the investor that's sanctioned, but maybe the investor's parent company is sanctioned. That's a little bit of a gray zone from a compliance standpoint that might make it difficult for the U.S. to wrap its head around if your company were coming through a CFIUS process or coming through a grant approval process. It's not about denying foreign investment because there's a lot of goodness in it, but it's about being smart in how we are looking at these foreign investors.
Who's responsible for doing that? Is it leaders, the companies themselves, or should they push and ask the question and then, all right, well, government told me no?
This is a great example of how I think there's so much space for partnership and education, right? My immediate reaction would be, it's absolutely everybody's responsibility to know who your investor is. But the reality is that a startup is trying to build its baby, right? Their time and energy is invested in building this new amazing technology or AI capability or whatever it might be. their attention rightly is not going to be on this. So there's got to be a way. And so this is a space where you start having conversations with the venture capital firms who are backing the companies, or even the larger institutional firms as well. Don't look just at what the financial returns are going to look like, because if that's what you're focused on, it may not necessarily always work out, particularly if you are in a space that's adjacent to anything that requires some sort of government review or potential investment.
Oh, Shannon, you've done it now. You've done it now. You've opened up my biggest area of passion. Number one is everyone, citizens and private companies alike, are responsible national security decision makers. So there's no more pretending by anybody that there aren't adversaries and competitors that would out there be advancing their interests at the expense of ours. Second, the U.S. government knows information that it needs to find a way to share. We've done a lot on the cybersecurity side, not as much as I think we need to, but we need to be able to share information with the people that we're expecting and, quite frankly, holding responsible for making these decisions. And I think this is a huge area that is yet unexplored. When we talk about open source and national security, the argument is usually around what are they taking in. I think we need to have a conversation about what information is being openly shared back with the
Mhm.
national security decision makers that don't happen to be in government. Because as Eric said, when there's a cyber incident, we are really willing to look at a company and say, well, why didn't you clean that up? And then the third thing is, while we're waiting for the government to be better at that, and I'm trying to encourage that front too, there are a lot of private companies that have stepped into what I'm going to call the counterintelligence space, that by using openly available information actually have a lot of good wisdom and insight in terms of what's going on out there, that when you can put it together, you can get a really good picture for an interest in your asset and give you some power to see that. I think you said it especially well. If we're going to tell people that they've got to be thinking of it, we've got to create the tools. I think there are some that you've mentioned, and I think there are ones in the offing that I think will make that better. I think we need to continue to highlight it. And I think the government, because Eric, on your who's responsible question, by being a career government employee, I always put more burden on them. They've got to share more of what they have because the world is playing out outside of their domain, but the impact of that play is going to come back on security. That was a really good conversation, Shannon. Thanks for that.
And I think, just to add on, if I can, from my own personal experience being an analyst who would do analytic outreach to the private sector, or in my prior jobs, helping to build some of these analytic outreach engagements, we would get so much benefit from talking to the practitioners in the fields that we were engaging on, whether it was in payments or whether it was talking with the investment banks who were involved in the particular range of mergers and acquisitions, to better understand how the deal making process works. But it's only so often that you can go to them and ask questions before they start saying, how are you going to help us out as well too? How can we be a better partner in this? Not a quid pro, but how can we be a better partner in this game, so that, to the point that you have tried to make so frequently, everybody understands what their responsibility is with respect to national security is not purely a business thing. My experience has been that these firms, when we go to them, they want to talk to us. They want to share with us because they understand the benefit of doing so, because it makes us do our job better, which therefore is just a healthy cycle. But yeah, I completely agree. This is definitely something that the government needs to do better at.
And especially as with this administration, we see a move away from centralized federal responsibility and pushing it out to state localities and individuals. It feels like there's a transition there where, to your point, we need to go more than just one-on-one. We need to lean a little bit into the things that we know and producing it in a manner that they can consume, not producing what the government consumes. Maybe we'll have to have another show on this.
Yeah. And startup founders have a lot of things to do, right? They are super busy. But one of the most important things they do for long-term effect for themselves is understand the cap table and how much equity they're giving away in terms of taking that money. And so I think that education, continuing to encourage them to look at where that money is coming from and understanding it, because that's going to affect them down the road and the potential contracts they can get with the government, and also just understanding where their IP is going when they send out those investor decks. Speaking of investment, we've been watching the TikTok. So, Wall Street Journal reported that after a phone call on September 19th, President Trump and China's President Xi signaled approval of a preliminary deal that would keep TikTok operating in the U.S. by shifting control of its U.S. operations to a new U.S.-based entity, reportedly with Oracle overseeing American user data while ByteDance retains a minority stake. Key details, including the algorithm and governance, remain unresolved, leaving some uncertainty despite the apparent breakthrough. What would an ideal framework include in this agreement, and what is something in the agreement you would never agree to?
Gosh, talk about we were watching this unfold before our very eyes, and I'm sure this
Yeah.
conversation will be outdated by the time it gets posted online. This has been such a fascinating story. This was actually one of the last transactions that I touched when I was at ODNI before I left the office that was responsible for doing the threat assessments. And I remember talking to somebody in my office who was very closely involved with doing the assessment on this transaction. And he said, this thing is going to go on for years. This is not going to resolve in the period of this transaction or even in this year. This will be going on for years. And so I think my first reaction is I think it's fantastic that we finally have a framework. I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the end. I think this is probably going to be something that will continue to evolve over time. I don't know that that necessarily means that we're talking about additional legislative extensions and the like, but the reality is that when it comes to developing CFIUS mitigation, they revisit it if necessary and make changes if necessary. Maybe this does become finalized in the not too distant future, but it will continue to evolve as it needs to. I think the framework that I've seen is I'm seeing the sort of things that I would probably want to see. The US, the consortium is their own 80% of TikTok. We're talking about Oracle holding the data. That's really great. We needed the data to be held here in the US. I like the idea that of the, I think, 7 board seats, only 1 will be a ByteDance board seat, and that member will not be on the security committee. I think that's extremely important. The part that I am a little unsure about is the algorithm. As I'm understanding, it sounds like we will own the algorithm, that the updates will happen here, but we license it to China. And I don't know enough to know whether or not that's going to fully address our concerns about China's ability to manipulate things and further influence the US through TikTok, right? I just don't know enough to know. And maybe there are some super smart people who are former colleagues of ours who can explain that, but that's just an area that I feel a little bit hesitant on. And I think hopefully that will be something that comes out a little bit more as the story plays on. I think the reality, though, is that TikTok has been here for years. It has 170 million plus US users. I think the concerns about Chinese access to data, and we're not talking about what you had for breakfast sort of postings, right, Eric? We're
Yeah.
talking about the mass amounts of data and what it can mean for China developing some exquisite AI capabilities that could potentially leapfrog the US, right? That is one of the big concerns that I have. So it's a good thing that we know that for now, the data is going to be held here.
Yeah, so actually, in every fora, when I talk about cybersecurity, and the question about TikTok always comes up, and come on, why are you really worried about it? And Shannon, I think you've mentioned one is just the massive amount of data that can be used by a nation state that has equivalent compute power to us and more lax views of privacy and what that allows them to do. And kind of you made this point earlier, what they can do with all that data is different from what we think that any of that data represents. And so that aggregation and what you can do in terms of patterns. So I think this is a good moment on the access to data front, although the barn door's been open for a while. The other thing is your question on the algorithm. Why did Elon Musk buy Twitter? Why did he buy X? And remember when everyone was decrying that it was a bad business deal, he understood fundamentally what it was culturally in order to be able to shape and have decision-making authority by your algorithms over what people saw. That is really hard to ascertain in small chunks when you see what gross effect is. And so much more so than any worry that I have, particularly about a backdoor, a technical backdoor, is really about, can we understand the algorithm in terms of what it's doing in aggregate about shaping and influencing belief structures by the mere slight manipulation of what you see and what you don't see. How we are able to look at that and how we're able to do the modeling of what algorithms will do when acting on lots of data, and how do you see those things happening is a really interesting question for us. But to your point, and I think this is the theme of the whole kind of digital currency, digital world, is we aren't walking this back. So
Right.
it is good that we are both recognizing that we have to be players globally. You can be American first, but you still have to participate. And then the second is, it isn't just a technical question. It is a question about, in this digital space, it is really easy to create action that seem normal, but in fact are not. Government participating, working with industry to try and find ways to be true to our values and protect our interests at the same time that we participate is, I think, going to be the work of the next generation.
Yeah, the influence operations and the algorithm there is really important. But I think what might be equally important, or maybe even more important, because I don't have the strong cyber background that y'all do, is the volume of data and data as a commodity
Sure.
to train future AI platforms, right? And keeping
Absolutely.
that here. And that's
Absolutely.
another reason that Musk bought X or Twitter, is because now he's not allowing that data to go out to other platforms to
Yeah.
train. Only Grok's able to train on that. And
Yeah.
so as we start to run out of training data, because it's finite, that humans have created before we transition to synthetic data, that's going to become
For
more
sure.
and more scarce.
100%. 100%.
All right. What else do we want to talk about?
What we missed, Shannon? Anything that you were hoping we'd ask you, or you're praying for this segment to be over?
Get me out of here.
Gosh, let's see here. I think the only thing that we haven't touched on was sanctions.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's really a ton more that I can offer with respect to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I do think that we're at a point where the options are starting to run out in terms of what we can do for sanctions. Secondary sanctions is really where it's at. And so it's interesting to watch how this is starting to play out right now. But I think if I could offer one thing to your listeners is, we often don't see the impact of sanctions immediately, like so much of economics. And so I know there was a lot of frustration at the outset of the Russia-Ukraine crisis when Treasury was issuing its sanctions and we weren't seeing the immediate deleterious impacts to the Russian economy that people wanted to see. There were some significant impacts, but some of those take time. And I do think we're at a point where we're going to start seeing the impact of sanctions that we implemented several years ago starting to have a real impact on the Russian economy itself. As a general sort of rule of thumb, I think sanctions is an art of the long view for these complicated issues, right? By implementing a sanction on a particular bad actor and you take them off the ability to use the US dollar to transact, of course, that's an immediate impact. But when you're talking about an impact to a major economic system like the Russian economy, I think we have to take the art of the long view on instances like that.
I think you could go back historically and look at sanctions on Iran. And when we looked at the effect that was having at a moment when we wanted to have some room to talk to more moderate actors there, it was hard given what the sanctions had created in terms of hardship on their side. So I think that's a great point. We'll have you back at some point and we'll talk about the yin and yang. Aren't tariffs also a long view issue? And now we have two major issues of this administration, both of which are likely to manifest outside of it.
I completely agree. And I'll use the time between now and then to get smart on tariffs.
Done and done. Done and done.
No, we super appreciate you coming on, Shannon. This has been an awesome conversation. And I
Awesome.
guess other thing I wanted to ask you just is, what are you watching and what do you think we should be looking at in the weeks ahead?
I think everything here that we've been discussing has been exactly the sort of thing that I'm watching on a daily basis. I do think the sovereign wealth fund is a very intriguing idea. I'm going to be very interested to see how that plays out. I think, as we talked about, there are some really potentially great advantages to having one, but we also need to remember how we looked at sovereign wealth funds when we are evaluating their investments here in strategic sectors. So it's just something to be mindful of. But I think everything that we've covered here is exactly the sort of thing that I'm watching on a daily basis.
So we'll have to have you come back.
I'd be delighted.
Wow. When we imagined bringing in a guest and we chose the topic, we thought of Shannon, we thought of digital currency, and
Yeah.
Eric, from my vantage point, this just delivered in spades.
Yeah, I think that when we started doing this show, it was things that I was interested in and learning more about and the conversations that we're having. And that was exactly the questions I wanted to ask and the things I wanted to learn about. And it was hard to stay engaged and
Well,
continue to ask her the questions because I was listening to her podcast.
I found the same moment. I was so enthralled
Yeah.
with what she was saying that that I was like, oh, wait, I should say something now. And
Yeah. I gotta keep this show going, keep this
Yeah.
thing on the tracks. All right. So what are you watching for next week?
So I think I'm watching Erdogan's visit the end of this week.
That's right. Thursday, right? Coming to the White House, talk F-16s and F-35s.
Yeah, and I have a lot of scar tissue around Erdogan and the president and what you think they're going to talk about, and then the press report of what they've decided. Last time this happened, it was during the Syrian conflict, so I have a lot of scar tissue around this. The other thing I think maybe we want to talk about around it is there's a lot of conversation in America right now about whether we're moving toward authoritarianism. And I think there's some interesting parallels with the journey Turkey's been on with
Sure.
Erdogan. And maybe we unpack that a little bit as a way to talk about how democracies move.
Yeah, and a crucial ally, right? They're a member of NATO since I think like the 50s, and they're also geographically at the intersection of Europe, Middle East, and then also holding access to the Black Sea and Russia.
And to your point about allies, there's hardly a more capable military force. They are a great military partner. Also, the intersection of religion in the Middle East. So just a really interesting nation. I know my friend Gina Haspel, who was the former director of CIA, spent a great deal of her career in Turkey, and her perspective to include respect for the Turks, really interesting. And I just think it's a complex, instructive picture. And then just everything else. Interesting to see a little bit about in the aftermath of the service for Charlie Kirk and how that plays out. I know the little piece I saw, and having experienced loss in my own life, my hope is that for the people that were there and for his family and those that were close to him, it provides some comfort and peace to feel the support. Then we can talk about other things about it, but that's my hope.
Yep, absolutely. And TikTok. We'll see what happens
Yeah.
with TikTok. Always watching TikTok.
And TikTok. I think there are a few conversations that you and I have had that I more enjoyed than our TikTok conversation with Shannon. Yeah, we'll watch that one too.
Well, that's what we're watching. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us. And as always, remember, we're here for you. Look for the link in the show notes to provide feedback or to suggest topics for the next time, and even guests if you have that in mind. I'm told that feedback is a gift, and Eric and I both believe in it because we feedback each other all the time. Join us next week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, please go forth, do good, and be kind to one another.